would expect that he'll get through the debate, but the question is, will he be intelligible the whole time?
Those are winning numbers. Those are numbers that says Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States.
He's on the verge of a 1980 Ronald Reagan blowout of Jimmy Carter. And I don't see practically how the Democrats offset reality.
They're going to game the system or, yeah, maybe even cheat.
How are we ever going to accept the results of this election in this kind of landscape?
Let's say by some weird, miraculous chance that we didn't see coming, given that Trump is ahead, has a 66% chance of winning, looks like he's going to get the electoral count, and Joe still wins. Well, then what do you do after you win? How do you convince anyone that's real?
Imagine if that was all the information you took in, right, between today and Election Day. If that was all you knew about the election, a distorted, bizarre, alternate reality not rooted in truth, where right now Donald Trump is, by their telling, so far out in front in the race for president in 2024 that the only thing standing between Trump and the White House again are the cheating Democrats. I guess that's how the conspiracy goes. What makes this alternate reality, this Fox News fantasy delusion, so dangerous is that conservative media, and Trump himself for that matter, are priming viewers and Trump supporters to reject any election that results in anything other than a Trump victory, such as the second Biden term, and to then once again accept a big lie about non-existent fraud. It's a political movement with a proven track record of inciting and leading to violence, such as on January 6th. But at the moment, as reported in the Washington Post, quote, the nation is experiencing a lull in political unrest. In fact, one of the quietest periods that extremism researchers have recorded in recent years. It might sound counterintuitive, but the phenomena are related. Because like we said, at the moment, Trump supporters are sure, they're positive. They've been told by Greg Gutfeld and Jesse Waters and Laura Ingraham specifically that he's going to win. And there's no need for violence, at least not yet, because the only way he loses is if Joe Biden and the Democrats cheat. Joining us, President of Media Matters for America, Angelo Carusone, is back, and former Deputy National Security Advisor under President Obama, Ben Rhodes, is here. Angelo, did I miss anything? I know you keep an eye on not just the segments, but the threads, the narrative threads on the right. What are we missing?
I think the one thing I would just note is that those samples at the intro were not sort of just cherry picked. They are reflective of what is happening on Fox News every single day. I mean, every single primetime host at Fox News has claimed that Democrats are going to cheat in order to steal the election in 2024. It's not just Laura Ingraham. I mean, that is reflective of it. In terms of what's missing, I think the two things I would notice is that the layering in more broadly in conservative media and Fox as well of religiosity. They really they've introduced a lot more religious language. So they keep referring to Election Day as a blessed event. They keep referring to Trump as somebody who's a vessel of Jesus Christ. So they are adding in a layer of holiness, and that I think is to help sort of justify and rationalize any sort of violence or action that individuals have to take if, say, Donald Trump doesn't win the election, that it's more than just the political consequences, that they have sort of a religious and moral duty to sort of take action. That's the first thing. And then the second thing I would just note that's a little scary is that we are in the calm before the storm. And I think part of the reason why there's a lull is in part because people really believe that Trump's about to win, but also because all the major social networks have basically turned off access to researchers that was previously in 16 and 20, so that reporters and researchers were actually able to understand and monitor much more of the chatter that was happening out there right now. So I also think there's a lack of visibility, but from our assessment, it's just as hot as it ever was.
Say more about what the social media companies have done in terms of making that opaque.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that social media companies, Facebook, Twitter, elsewhere, they used to have these services that would give researchers and reporters access to large amounts of data so that they could not just look at one post or two, but sort of get a good sample of what was happening under the hood. Those tools have been turned off or greatly reduced or shut off entirely by the major social networks. So if you're a researcher or a reporter doing this work, you don't really have the ability to do that tracking in the way that you were just, say, 2 years ago. And I do think that lack of visibility means that there's not reporters out there who are helping say, hey, here's a spotlight that we're seeing trends that are emerging. So a lot of these things are happening not only in plain sight, but also one layer behind a veil in these private or closed communities. And that's the part where I think it all comes full circle, because one of the things that Trump and the Republicans have done this cycle, and right-wing media, that's even scarier than the last cycles, is that they've gone further and further into what used to be considered the fringes, into much more violent parts of sort of the populace, actual like Nazis, not, people that are just white supremacists or racist, but like actual neo-Nazi organizations and paramilitary groups to say, hey, it's time for you to be activated as well. And it's not just our opinion or assessment. Trump has been giving wink and a nods to those individuals at his rallies, because that is part of who and where they're beginning to increasingly organize power now. And the mechanism for doing that is right-wing media. It's making it more acceptable. And the social media is really the platform and the forum in which they do that. So I think it is a lot scarier, frankly. And I don't, I get why it's calmer, because they're excited, but it's also a lot more sort of opaque and confusing. And there's not a lot of ability for the public to really see what's going on right now.
Let me show you again where we get our data and our information. This is Trump supporter Stephen Ayers describing the call and response between Trump and his supporters on January 6th, Ben.
President Trump is still promoting the big lie about the election. How does that make you feel?
It makes me mad, because I was hanging on every word he was saying. Everything he was putting out, I was following it. I mean, if I was doing it, hundreds of thousands or millions of other people are doing it, or maybe even still doing it. It's like he just said about that. You got people still following and doing that. Who knows what the next election could come out? They could end up being down the same path we are right now. I mean, just don't know.
I mean, Ben, one of the pieces of information we have that we didn't have the last two times Trump was a candidate is that his followers do what he tells them to do, many of them. There isn't a sort of braking system around a threat for violence for Donald Trump. And they will attack law enforcement if they stand in their way. And so I guess my concern is that we don't always have these conversations in sort of acknowledging our post-January 6th reality. And I wonder, heading into a debate, whether there needs to be a warning or any sort of different flag on rhetoric that in the past, for Mr. Ayers at least, led him to carry out acts of violence against cops. What sort of concerns do you have on the security front before Trump addresses more human beings than he's addressed probably in his career?
Well, I think what you see is this kind of symbiosis between Trump and right-wing media, and it's always been a chicken and egg as to who's leading and who's following between those two. But if I think back, I mean, part of the reason I think we should be so concerned is that if I think back, to 2008, Fox News wasn't nice to Barack Obama, but it was kind of like, we're going to throw a lot of stuff at Barack Obama, and then he won, and they dealt with that. There was no questioning of legitimacy of the election. 2012 was a harder thing for them to swallow, but still. And then even through 2020, you saw some of this before the election, but nowhere near the scale that we're seeing now. And so the point is, there's been an evolution in the information environment into which it is now completely normal for there to be regular, allegations that the Democrats are going to steal the election. There's a kind of messianic, air to Trump and his campaign. This is more than zero sum. This is like an existential battle in which there's no result that is legitimate other than Trump winning. And so all that is plowing the ground beforehand. It's kind of like a radicalization process where that there's an event on the calendar of the election, and that there's millions of people who are being conditioned to believe that one result is totally legitimate. We haven't been there before, Nicole. I mean, that wasn't necessarily the case in the run-up to 2020 because Trump was president, and it felt like, their guy was calling the shots. And so now, from this insurgent position, they're basically being told there's no outcome that's legitimate other than him winning, and because he's leading the polls, there's no way that it can possibly be true that he loses if that happens. And again, if you're looking at this from a kind of pure radicalization standpoint, they're creating a massive information ecosystem designed to make people believe that. And I do think that part of what needs to be done is efforts by lots of people. Look, even Trump supporting Republicans who are more responsible, and I don't hold out a lot of hope for this, beginning to talk about the integrity of the election, right? There has to be a way to puncture some of that information bubble and tell people what is true and what is fiction when it comes to the conduct of the election itself, and that you can support Trump and still be in a place where you have to accept the result if he loses, and we don't see much of that at all. In the debate, I think he needs to be called out. I get that there's not going to be real-time fact-checking in this debate, but I do believe that if it gets in the direction of the big lie, or it gets in the direction of integrity of elections, or it gets into these kind of wild, totally unproven claims about Democrats cheating, I do think he needs to be fact-checked on that stage, because certain information, really is dangerous to the health of the democracy.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.